The January transfer window closed yesterday, and it was pretty quiet on the Barcelona front. Plenty did happen, and there were some underrated moves that you might have missed, but a lot of the big stuff for Barcelona isn't anything that's too exciting right now, but it definitely will be in the future. Welcome to episode 656 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Podcast Network. I'm Dan Hilton, and yeah, I usually do the top fives on Fridays, but with the January transfer window ending, I figured it was a much more appropriate time to get all this news out there, and it gave us a little bit of a week and a half for a much bigger news dump. If you want more specific content like this, you can help me out on Patreon, like my new top-tier Patreons, Nicholas and Tiana. Subscribe on YouTube, like and leave a comment to feed the almighty algorithm, and of course, follow me anywhere on social media. All right, with that out of the way, let's dive in your January transfer window top five. Our first thing is talking about renewals galore. I know renewals can be kind of boring. It depends on the player, but the headliners here are Pedri and Gavi. We already talked about Araujo renewing, but Barcelona using this January transfer window to secure arguably their second and third most important players, and I'm saying that behind Lamine Yamal, for the next 5 years. That is not a bad thing for the club's future, especially allowing them to renew them now, know that number, and then reevaluate the wage bill with those two signed for long term come the summertime. It was also pretty terrific timing for both players. For Pedri, after missing so many of the previous 3 seasons due to injury, he's finally healthy again, and the 22-year-old has been Barca's most important midfielder this season. The team looks way different, that means in a better way when he is on the field. A lifelong fan of the club, he wanted to be here and fans wanted him here, and that's why as a club, you just get it done. But next season, it's likely that he'll join just 76 other players with over 200 appearances for the club, and he's set to pass the likes of Johan Cruyff, Neymar, and Dembélé in total appearances this season already. This is, at 22 years old, certainly a future legend of the club in the making. Secure him for the long term, good idea. As for Gavi, the 20-year-old has come back from his ACL injury, and after 3 to 4 months of staying healthy and regaining his fitness, the club and player can now both be assured that he's definitely back and nothing seems to be lingering from the injury. Like Pedri, he didn't start at Barca, but unlike Pedri, he's been with the club since he was 11 years old, coming from Real Betis, and also made his debut as a teenager. Also like Pedri, it's hard to imagine just how many appearances he makes for the club when all is said and done in his Barcelona career. In lesser news, because this is a lesser future, Inigo Martinez has a contract extension that has gone into effect, so he will be back next season as well. It was an activation of that renewal clause that guaranteed that he'd stick around if he played at least 60% of official matches this season. And after the start to his year, it looks like that will be the case, even with the return of Araujo. And finally, this one isn't done yet, but it seems like it's been verbally agreed upon, so pen should be put to paper in a few weeks' time when Baba Karuma turns 16. It does seem like it's been reported that he will sign a 3-year renewal when he turns 16 later in the month. Ajax and Man City were lurking, as Man City often do with a lot of Barcelona Academy players, but it appears, as I said, like he'll be sticking around. Ines Moriba's younger brother has gotten some comparisons to Yaya Touré, because at this point, no one knows if he'll be as a pro, a center back, or a defensive midfielder, but it could also be both. That's his versatility and abilities and all the different things as a raw prospect he has at the moment. With that contract renewal, it's also been reported that he'll jump to Juvenil A, the U19s. And as I've said before, when I did that La Masia profile, I even wrote something for him on the website. If you were to rank him as a prospect from 1 to 5 and say that Tony Fernandez and Guy Fernandez are 1 prospects, or Lamine Yamal and Pau Gasly aren't even prospects, but you get my point. Guy Fernandez, Tony Fernandez, they're from 1 to 5, 1 prospects in the academy. Baba Karuma at the moment, I'd say, is about a 2, but since he turned 16 in a few weeks, the next 12 months or so, especially with the U19s and breaking potentially into Barca Athletic next season, he could quickly become a 1 prospect. He's raw, yes, but all of the tools, ball playing ability to move with the ball, his defensive acumen, all those different things could make him a top prospect of Barcelona in the next 12 months or so. Our second piece of news is about the outros, and Unai Hernandez in particular leads the outros, which does tell you for the first team that there wasn't much movement. Yes, there were sniffs about Ansu Fati. Yes, there were sniffs about Pablo Torre right near the end there with Porto, but nothing came to fruition. So Unai Hernandez is our biggest name to talk about as far as transfers out of Barcelona right now. The 20-year-old attacking midfielder has gone to Al Ittihad in the Saudi Pro League for 5 million euros, a league that spent a lot of money this January window. This was the final year of his contract, and the club had the option to extend it for 2 more seasons, but that didn't happen. I think the club and the player both kind of agreed that that wasn't going to be his future. He did vow to return in his goodbye message, and that could happen. But I also saw news about Barca brass being upset about him leaving, but I don't really get that. This seems good for club and player. While we want to see him go to a league that more people watch to really know his level, you know what I say. As a youngster, especially, you don't know about your injury future and you don't know where your career is going to go next. So get that bag when you can. He is still 20, so he can also make some money now and still have time to come back to Europe in the future. As for Barcelona, you made $5 million on a player who is playing in the third division for your reserve team. That is a nice little payday, all things considered. And I've talked about Unai Hernandez before as a talent. Was he good enough for the first team? Absolutely. Yes, already, based on what he's done with the reserves over the last 2 seasons. But there are so many players already in his position. Pablo Torre is a bigger talent, and look where he's at. And that includes other youngsters like Guy Fernandez and possibly Tony Fernandez. So it was hard to see him getting much time with the first team moving forward. And yeah, you never know what's going to happen next 5 to 7 years. So Unai Hernandez, I hope you come back, and I hope you just continue to progress outside of the club for now. I'm glad the club got some money in return. Pau Pring was the other name that seemed to be circulating to be leaving the club. And the last we heard was that a verbal agreement had been reached with Al Sadd, that's Xavi's former club in Qatar. But I haven't seen any updates since then. And he is still a player with Barca Athletic with a contract officially set to expire in June. Pau Pring was a bigger name in the academy through the years than Unai Hernandez was. And the first half of the season had gone pretty well for him after struggling last year, at least until contract negotiations did break down and he was out of the Barca Athletic squad. Exactly like Unai Hernandez, though, the door is open for return someday, but a payday for the player and a fee for the club isn't the worst thing right now. But if that's not happening because he's leaving on a free, maybe that door is closed a little bit more. Between Bernal, Casado, De Jong, Pedri, plus Pedro Soma, and I've also told you to look out for Kuruma and Pedro Rodriguez, the double pivot is a pretty full position, and it's hard to see him breaking into the first team. But as an 18-year-old, there is still a lot of time left in his career to see how he continues to improve. So I don't know, maybe he's going to do that at Barca Athletic in these few months. Maybe he renews, or maybe he is going to leave on a free in the summertime. I can't imagine he'll be back. It's not really news, but after everything during this transfer window, Ansu Fati is sticking around now as expected. I've already done the whole thing about him for the last few top fives, and I bet I'll keep doing it throughout the spring, whether or not this was the right move for Ansu. I saw online somebody say that they can't believe Ansu has become the new Samuel Umtiti, and having enjoyed when Umtiti was actually Umtiti before the injuries, that one did sting. That one hurt. I didn't like it. So let's hope that things go better for Ansu now going forward. Another guy we keep talking about in the top fives was Alex Valle. He's officially now on loan to Como. So the loan deal to Celtic was cut short. Now he's a Como player officially. And not only is he player for them, but he's already made his debut playing 85 minutes as a starter for Como against Bologna, the same club that just signed Astanas Pedrola on loan, for which Barcelona still have a small sell-on fee if they buy him from Sampdoria. For Valle, a starting spot at a Serie A side could be a slight upgrade to being a rotation piece for Celtic, whose Champions League campaign, yes, they're a Champions League side, but that campaign could be over in 2 weeks' time after that tie with Bayern Munich. But crazier things have happened, so you don't want to count out Celtic. Either way, it seems like the right midseason move for Valle, who also speaks the same native language as his coach Cesc Fabregas, so if he's just a starter at a Serie A side, that's good stuff for Alex Valle. And then the one big arrival, if you want to call it that, comes from Barca Athletic. It's a striker, Alan Godoy from Eldense, who signs until 2027. It's an interesting move in terms of goal scoring because he hasn't scored for Eldense in 13 appearances this season, playing only 400 minutes. The 21-year-old came up through Las Palmas and then mainly out of his youth system, but he's been bouncing around on loans and free transfers for a few seasons now. This might sound insane, but having Pedri just signed his renewals, I wonder if these two might be childhood friends. It's just Conspiracy Dan talking. Maybe these two are childhood friends or something, being the same age and from the same place. And maybe Pedri asked for him. Because without scoring any goals or anything like that, I don't know if he's really at the level. But he's also still a young player at 21, so he has room to improve. And maybe Barca Athletic just wanted a depth forward and other players at that level wanted to be starters, so he was the player that was available. That could just be all there is to it. So welcome to the club, Alan Godoy. Let's pick up the pace a little bit with our final 3 pieces of news. First, it's not really affecting the club, but it's Marcus Rashford to Aston Villa and Nico Gonzalez to Man City, which actually does affect FC Barcelona. But for Marcus Rashford, of course, that kind of puts to bed the idea that he was going to be a player for Barcelona because he's already holding an Aston Villa jersey. They will pay a significant portion of his salary, something that Barcelona couldn't do because they kept Eric Garcia and Ansu Fati. plus performance-related add-ons, so that number just seems way too high for Barca. And obviously, that being Aston Villa, can afford that move because John Duran, the recent 21-year-old star forward, went to Al Nassr in Saudi Arabia, Cristiano Ronaldo's club, for 77 million euros, so they could definitely afford to bring in Rashford on loan. There could be a buy clause in there too, which would likely rule out a summer move to Barcelona for Rashford if Aston Villa decide to go with that move. Nico Gonzalez, meanwhile, former academy and first-team player, is going from Porto to Man City for 60 million euros. It does sting that he didn't get the chance to improve at Barca the way he has at Porto, but he did improve at Porto. He's a much different player than the one who left Barca, and I think from what I've seen of him, he just controls the game so much more. I saw him live in the preseason playing as a defensive midfielder for Barcelona, and even when he arrived at Porto, he was kind of stuck as an 8, where he wasn't really affecting the game as an attacker, and he didn't really have the instincts refined enough to be that defensive midfielder. But now at Porto, he really has settled into a deeper position, something that Pep Guardiola and Man City could desperately use now, especially without Rodri still for the remainder of this season. They're in need of somebody who can set the tempo and set the plate and control a match, because Man City have just not been able to do that this year. The Barca part of this story, I don't know. It's been spun in a negative way for Barca because they did, in their belief, hold a 40% sell-on clause for the player, meaning they were expected to receive around 24 million euros from the deal, from Porto to Man City being 60 million. But Porto said that there was a clause in there, which again doesn't make sense for Barca to have done this, but this is maybe the desperation from when they made that move, that there was a 3 million euro clause in there that if Porto paid the 3 million, then it would be 20% of a sell-on clause instead of a 40%, which basically cuts that number in half. So instead of receiving 24 million euros, that means that Barcelona would instead be receiving 13 million euros from the deal, as Nico Gonzalez signs his 6-year deal for Pep Guardiola and Man City. But I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel about this. 13 mil is still 13 mil. It stings, yes, that Nico Gonzalez couldn't figure it out at Barcelona yet, but it was also really crowded in that midfield. Would he have ever become that player that he did at Porto? I don't think so. Players at that age, 21, 22, they need reps. They need time. And he's become a better player, so I'm happy for him. And I'm glad that Barcelona got a little bit of something for having created him to be the player that he is. Our fourth piece of news in regard to the stadium, here's a little bit of an update. It's construction news. I know everyone comes here for that. This is why I'm going to try to get through this one quickly. It's the most predictable news of the week as well, because Barca had another stadium update that isn't really good news, but at least this time it's not really bad news either this week. The latest is that the lease at the Olympic Stadium in Montjuic, which was set to expire in April, could be finagled to end in May instead, so that El Clasico can be played there in case the Spotify Camp Nou isn't ready. Which, if the club is going through this process to work through the logistics of stadium events to figure this out, you already have your answer as to how likely they'll be back in the stadium by the beginning of May. I said this years ago at this point. Construction anywhere always takes longer than you expect and always costs more than you expect. And it's certainly true in Spain. Again, I reiterate, how do you think Florentino Perez made his money? Big contracts and big construction projects that drag on and cost too much. If they can, and that's a big if, return to the Camp Nou in Spain, it will be for 60,000 people, which is still way more than can fit at Montjuic at the moment. So that would be nice, yes. Then by next summer of 2026, the stadium capacity should be up to 105,000 people, making it the largest stadium in Europe. Filling it, yes, that's another problem. But if people do return to the stadium, as I've spoken about before, a lot of Barcelona's financial issues will, not to say disappear quickly, but they will be much easier to handle because of gate revenue. You do the simple math, 35,000 people in a stadium on average to, let's say the average becomes 65 or 85,000, and that's not even close to full capacity. That does help your bottom line, obviously. And then our fifth piece of news is that it was a weird week for the Femení. In your weekly Now Femení update, yeah, it was just odd. They did lose a game in Spain. I'll say it again. They lost a game in Spain for the first time in 57 matches, which in itself is an accomplishment. When these streaks end, you take them for granted as they're happening, but to be unbeaten in the league for 57 straight matches is a consistency over multiple years that is hard to fathom. They lost to Levante 2-1 in a wild game. Well, at least one that had a wild ending, with both Levante and Barcelona scoring in stoppage time and Levante having picked up a red card in the match as well. But if you want a lesson in time wasting, I do not recommend watching this match because Levante had time wasting just the perfect amount. And by perfect amount, I meant so much more than I'm used to seeing. And that's saying something when you watch regular Liga matches. The time wasting here was completely outrageous. I'm obviously not hitting any panic buttons for the Femení after one loss in like 2 years in the league, after outshooting their opponents 43-6 in that match. So yes, not worried about them. On the squad front for the Femení, Ingrid Engen didn't leave after all, and Kerry Walsh didn't go to Arsenal. But Kerry Walsh instead went to Chelsea, potentially freeing up minutes in that deeper midfielder role for Engen. Though it's been reported that Per Romeo doesn't really rate Engen as a midfielder as much as he does a defender. It has been tough this season for Engen to get minutes, but with so many matches left this season in multiple competitions, one injury and Engen could become essential again, just as he was last season. As for Walsh, she ends her time just like her countrymate in Lucy Bronze did at the club. She came, played well, added depth, played in some big games, won some trophies, and is now heading back home after not too long, having been in Catalonia. Walsh will be missed, yes, but with Patri healthy and Alexia healthy again, it's hard to imagine that Walsh would have started the biggest games of the season, which I think is something she wanted to do. And Chelsea does give her a chance to do that. Remember, they were perfect in the group stage, so they could be a team that rivals Barcelona to the very end. And in the Champions League, Kerry Walsh still could play for Chelsea and be registered for them in that competition, so they might meet again. All right, there's your news dump. Make sure you join me tomorrow. What's that, like 36 hours from now? 3:30 p.m. East Coast time on Big Up for the watch-on against Valencia in the Copa del Rey quarterfinal. Barcelona the heavy favorites, but hey, you don't advance in a knockout competition until you're holding that trophy, or at least until you advance here to the semifinals. So you can join me for that one on Big Up, have a talk with me, jump in the chat, or even come on and request to be on the show with a microphone. As always, until next time, Forza Barca.